I always open doctoral exams with this question. Please complete this sentence. The thesis of my thesis is that. That's the hardest question they could get. Everybody knows the topic, but the thesis. All right, the thesis of my talk tonight is that bethinking, my talk is called The Virtue of Bethinking by the Bowels of Christ. The thesis is that bethinking is an intellectual virtue that bears on a condition that conduces to civil discourse, relating to topics about which it is often difficult to be civil. For example, religious, political, and moral discourse. I quoted that from the assignment. I've tried to follow it very liberally. The only new word I introduced was bethinking, and I want you to be thinking about bethinking. The criterion, I think, for the choice of a virtue were found among this company. Number one, it has to be intellectual. And I think the word bethinking tells us the word thinking there. So that's pretty well located there. Secondly, it has to have to do with virtue. And much of my talk will be to try to show how and why bethinking can be a contribution to civil discourse. Third, I suppose you'd have to say it has to be a reflection of the speaker's own interest. You can't just make it up suddenly and frightening occasion like this. Fourth, it has to be multi-purpose. Whatever we're talking about with civil discourse has to begin with the agent who is discoursing, who is speaking. And so somehow or other, bethinking means the self-evaluation of a person. Add to that, if there's an I-thou dimension to it, Buber, Levinas, etc., because discourse implies the other. It has to have a civil ring to it, which could mean both the civil order and being civil. Further, it probably shouldn't be overdone. It's the end of day, and you get kind of weary. And if I do one more of the familiar virtues, I don't stand much chance of holding attention. I may have trouble anyhow, but I don't worry about that. It's useful if you use a term that won't catch on. I'm quite confident if you go somewhere and you talk about the virtues and you say, we learned a new one there, it's called bethinking, they will wonder who you are, what's happening. I say that because I'm new to the Virtues League, and I know that enough of you who've been doing it for a long time know depths of this subject that I couldn't possibly touch. But I couldn't find anybody who had ever written about bethinking. So I'm safe there. And I have strong interest in the subtopic, which I think is what credentialed me enough to be invited here, civil discourse, because most of the projects that were referred to here were occasioned by the fact that there was an absence of civil discourse. Conflict prevailed. The fundamentalism in the project of the MacArthur Foundation was precisely that. We did 6 volumes and 18 conferences and 33 religions and 200 scholars, and I challenge you to find somebody who found it going uncivil. It's a very hard topic when you're dealing with a lot of secular scholars and so on. You're talking about fundamentalism, but they all learn the rules of the game. Spinoza's great mind. When a topic is complex, I have made a sedulous effort, sedulo coravi, not to laugh, not to cry, not to prophesy, not to dispose of, but to understand. And I think that's one of the key things that I'd like to keep coming back to tonight. The Public Religion Project was of the same character. I used to head the Parkwood Center of Health, Faith, and Ethics. And there again, can you think of anything more controversial than kind of questions on the news today about who owns the fetus? What's missing from all of these is humility. And so I came to get a dose of humility today. I was on one of the Templeton humility committees, but I admired them, but I didn't really catch on. And I noticed that if there's a common denominator that animates what you're about, it is to invest the subject of virtue and discourse with that, and I applaud that. When we talk about the absence of civil discourse, it's always easy to get trapped in the present moment. And just if I were to chronicle what you all know, we'd rack up television, news media, people talking about, people in the bar, wherever. Everyone is pretty well sure that there's never been such a bad time for civil discourse as there is right now. Jose Ortega y Gasset says that we always have to do our thinking. I am I and my circumstance, circumstantia, what stands around me. And we're now living in a world where the current circumstance is that. So everybody's real nostalgic for the good old days of the Eisenhower era, when everybody loved everybody. Eisenhower was said to have a very fervent faith and a very vague religion. And he said everybody had to have a religion, I don't care what it was. And I happen to like him pretty well. There's a lot of nice things about him. But I don't know if you recall, but there was something called the Cold War going on all the time. And if we're nervous about things now, we were nervous then. It's during that period that Will Herbert, first of all, wrote about civic religion, and then Robert Bellah with his classic essay on civil religion, which gave us a new element in the vocabulary. But the sudden turn from when he wrote that till a book he wrote a couple years later, in which he said, this was the Nixon era, had Richard Nixon been the president at the time of the writing, I could not have written it. It wasn't just a Republican loss of conversation. The favorite word we use for when it broke down is, the last 30 years, polarization. Left and right polarization. And people don't understand each other and maybe don't understand themselves. And if you chronicle it all over religion, think of the denominational splits of the last 20, 30 years. Mainly over sexual issues, but if not that, they'll find something else. The parties are polarized, but also within the parties there's more fighting going on. Evangelicals, we always count on evangelicals to hang in there, be united, and yeah. Dr. Nash has a poem, I'm a stranger here myself. I always get invited to evangelical things way back to early Billy Graham days, and they always say, this year's invited non-evangelical scholar is Martin Marty. I'm the only person in the room who belongs to a church body with the word evangelical in its very title. And I felt very much at home in it along the way. But now you have to decide which wing of evangelicalism is it. It's not all bad, so this can be a sign of vitality too. Some of the talks this afternoon about the apathy that can come with mere tolerance suggests that maybe if people don't believe deeply, we better be careful. Under it all, though, I still think there's something else going on. Maybe my pastoral years conditioned me to it, and that is most people who are concerned positively about religion are so because it represents to them the cure of souls, consolation, inspiring great music and art, devotion, dealing with the passages of life, and then, incidentally, the public and the civil order, which is where these conflicts are most visible. My own approach had never been via the virtues. I was on several commissions who were studying the national character and character as such. They got off to a bad start because so much of the early virtue talk was, in our language, neocon. The man I knew best among them was Bill Bennett, who wrote the big book on virtues, and enough said on that. Yeah. Stranger. I listened carefully today and learned a lot. And I noticed that sooner or later it came to a point which indicates a little bit of the strangeness that my breed has in virtue talk. Richard Mao nailed it when he said, oh, we have Paul, we have Augustine, and we have Luther sort of at the edges. Well, I'm Lutheran, and so that puts me at a disadvantage. We don't write many books on virtue. Professor Meilander, are you here? There, his father is a real expert on it. I don't know how he did that and stays in the Lutheran church. He really knows virtue. But We don't do a lot about that. Luther didn't do a lot about that. And I have to identify, I can't run away from it. I always tell people, they ask you what kind of Lutheran are you, because there are different reads of it. I always say I'm a fanatic Lutheran. In the definition of the great Chicago humorist who invented Mr. Dooley, the Irish epigram writer. Mr. Dooley says, a fanatic is someone who knows he's doing exactly what the Lord would do if the Lord were also in possession of the facts. So I'm trying to smuggle Luther into the virtue language. And I think it's not hard to do. I think Lutherans got in a bad habit of not knowing their heritage. Let's remember Luther was Augustinian, and there's a lot of it there. And in Luther too. But he was always worried, or people were always worried about, is it work righteousness? You know, you care about character and formation and so on. And aren't you going to clean that in front of God? We tell the story of a guy who did everything right. He was a Lutheran, he went to catechism, he did everything right. Oh man, was he a Lutheran. And he died. And life to come, he gets there and he said, I didn't think this would be quite so hot. Really hot. Well, there's no guy over there you can ask. White terracloth robe, sweating away with a fan. Martin Luther. How did you get to this place? It was works. You learned a little late. But in trying to figure all these things out, I also admire the comic who said, W.C. Fields, I've been reading the Bible assiduously for 19 years, looking for a loophole. And my loophole on Luther and the virtues is a distinction that's often forgotten. When he's talking about salvation, die Gerechtigkeit, die vor Gott gilt, you don't give a fig about character or anything like that. Because these could all be things you use and to parade in front of God, and you'll lose the gift of faith. But he also talked very much about civic faith. You're highly impelled to do that. I once wrote a commentary on his large catechism, and I'm surrounded by people who say you're not supposed to touch the law. 60% of the large catechism is an exposition of the Ten Commandments and law interpretations of the other documents along the way. In civic virtue, he was very concerned, and we heard some of that, Professor Mamo today, on that virtue can be present beyond the circle of those who have the Gerechtigkeit, die vor Gott guilt. He is said to have said, better be ruled by a smart Turk than a dumb Christian. He didn't say that, but he would have if he'd known that we needed a condensation of what he did say. But Roland Bainton always claimed that, no, he didn't say it, but he wrote long essays. We've got 110 volumes, we get a lot of chance to go longer than epigrammatically. But he had a lot of room for growth in grace and character and so on, as long as it wasn't attached to the salvation story. And therefore it became the religion of justification by faith. With the 500th anniversary of Luther coming up, 95 Theses in 2017, being a Lutheran, I have to get invited, I have to write some essays about it and so on. And they all talk about justification by faith, or better, justification by grace through faith. And they refine it. Oh, do they refine it? Oh, man, that's right over here. And I said, how am I going to handle this? And I found Martin Luther saying, of course I believe in justification by faith. That's the whole deal. But I never preach about it. Why? Because the people fall asleep, and they tell jokes, and they leave early, and so on. And I thought, oh, man, I'm clear. Because it's an abstraction. What did he do? He said, so I tell the stories of the gospel, and Paul, and Isaiah, and so on. That was the message. And it's the same story, but in a different language. So, in choosing this concept to introduce a virtue from a Puritan revolutionary, into this discourse, I chose Cromwell, who on August 3rd, 1650, said in conflict with Scotland, "My brethren, by the bowels of Christ I beseech you, bethink you that you may be mistaken." I've loved that for the longest time, and I really think I can defend at some length the proposition that at the root of most uncivil discourse, or the breakdown of discourse in general, is the absence of our ability to consider the limits of our own. And we heard some wonderful talks today that reminded us of this, how we go about it. The verb bethink, I had to work with that because I wanted to smuggle this in here somehow, and I had to make a virtue out of it. What does it mean? To bethink is to cause oneself to consider something. So, Cromwell said, I want you to consider that you might possibly be mistaken. Bethinking can be applied to propositions, problems, controversies, situations, material things along the way. But in the end, I think the key word in the definitions is consider something. I just, for fun, one of my belated hobbies, I still use the big, fat, heavy Oxford English Dictionary. I can never get it back up on the shelf. I have to invite one of my offspring. That's why we have 20 grandchildren, 20 great-grandchildren. And I'm always busy with that volume, trying to pick, bethink. I've racked them all up, all the options. I think there are 13 options for bethink, and 12 of them say obsolete. It died around 1649, and that's a few years after Cromwell used it, so it's not there. There's one more moderating one called archaism. So it's either obsolete or getting very tired and old. You have to smuggle it and put it in place. But I've often found that if I use the word that's been used too often, what could I say among you experts on prudence, moderation, if you don't already know? So it bethought me that maybe I should think about this. And why that violently pious injunction? By the bowels of Christ. Well, I looked that one up on the great Google. There must be a Roman Catholic commentator who says of the bowels of Christ, quote, "Although the Sacred Heart, the precious blood, and the body of Christ are venerated by Christians, this odd-looking phrase should not be taken literally. Cromwell used an archaic figurative meaning for the scent of pity in the gentler emotions." And that's what he meant, and it comes pretty close, I suppose, to what it was. But I think the people of the Kirk of Scotland, whether they were sitting or not, knew that he was really trying to get their attention. This really, really, really mattered. Yea, hear it or not, with the outward ear only, ye Kirk committee and prophesying governing persons everywhere, it may be important to you to learn what this is along the way. What are the arenas in which this comes up? Closest, I think, is in personal vocation. Testing ourselves every day. When we read this along the way, I don't think we can enter and expect civil discourse if we haven't examined ourselves and see where it hasn't been present. And I think you can usually tell from any long time you've had discourse with someone or other whether there's somebody who is self-reflective. By the bowels of Christ, that's where you start. And I think second is I-thou relations, one-on-one. Buber's great thing, Emmanuel Levinas, the philosophy of the face. Here's where you really have to test whether there's a true regard for the other, and whether it has occurred to you that if there's a breakdown somewhere, that you might be the one making a mistake. It's any situation that calls for empathy, and that's the academy, education, the church, the political order, the few people in politics that most of it long admired are people who had true empathy for the others. The others we might be frightened by, or might vote for, or might be led by, but they're not revered. And we tend to revere those that had a true empathy. And you can't fake that just for Fox News and suddenly get empathy and show that you're there. The other party will isolate that in no time at all, and you'll be smoked out. But people who cultivate this by the bowels of Christ, gaining empathy. And I don't think we should minimize the role of action along the way. Any good things happening? Yes. I think there are exceptions to it. And I think we should make the most of every such model. I don't know how it is with everybody else, but at our house, I called tonight, as always, 2 hours ahead of us. David Brooks was on. It wasn't Mark Shields, but somebody else taking his place. How many of you ever watched David Brooks, Mark Shields? Public television. Okay. I recommend that. I don't think you'll ever miss. Everybody else has MSNBC, I don't care what they are. There are 2 people or 3 or 4 in boxes, right? One is in Los Angeles, one in Boston, one in Tehran, and they shout at each other. Their job, they're supposed to. It helps the ratings if they're really angry. And I never picture anybody changing in the light of it. But listen to Brooks and Shields. They're at the table next to each other, the face, they look at each other, and you'll hear a wonderful phrase. You know, Mark, I never thought of that before. That does not happen when people are set up in the boxes, there's separate sponsorship and separate parties. I never thought of that before. That's a good idea. I did my ministerial internship in Washington, D.C. This will give my age away. 1951. In that time of Eisenhower and peacefulness, and by then it was Truman, and Cold War, McCarthy coming on the scene. And there were 9 of us interns, Protestant interns, and we took our Tuesdays off together in the Senate. Why? Because it was such a wonderful illustration. We could hear Robert Taft debate Paul Douglas. You talk about people that are living in different worlds, they really were. Very conservative Republican and very liberal Democrat. Or we could stick around, there were always 2/3 of the room was full, Senate floor. Margaret Chase Smith debating Estes Kefauver. These names will only mean something to a few of you. You have to have been back there to know it. But I'm trying to say they were extremely intense people who had learned some disciplines for listening to the other and developed personalities to go with it. A member of our church, Christ Lutheran Church on 5121 16th Street, had a congressman from Michigan named Hook, a liberal Democrat labor man, who got into a physical fight on the floor with, of course, a fellow Democrat, but he was from Mississippi and Dixiecrat style. As the Baptist pastor said, you would have thought our guy would have won because he had a cane. Our guy was named Hook. And he took him. That Sunday noon, both of them and their wives, and the 2 pastors and their wives are at Westminster together, getting a little message and saying, you can't govern a country that way. Tomorrow morning you go back to that house and you better know to learn to listen to the other, and so on. And I followed the record later on. There were a lot of times when things actually happened along that way. Very often if it's combined with action, it's a part of it. I spent a lot of my energy these years on Muslim and everybody else relations. If you want to hear the uncivil, you would see plenty of it because of ISIS and ISIS, who are lethal, dangerous. We better watch them, better confine them. I'm almost on the verge of saying I'm ready to let a few civil liberties go because I'd rather know if they're after them before they get us. Yeah, I don't know that. But on the larger pattern, then listen to the people on television who make their living off spreading hate of the Muslim. And there are plenty. They write best-selling books. in the western suburbs of Chicago, near Wheaton, Naperville, all those towns, I've done numbers of these occasions. And what's interesting to me is these institutions, by the way, have a pretty good record of dealing with them, but not in public, in the public media. And one night, maybe 400 people in the room, and I just said to your own local folk, stand up if you are a physician or a nurse or a hospital employee and a Muslim. 20, 30, 40 people got up. That's my doctor. He's my doctor. What a wonderful guy. I said, well, you better get acquainted. You have to overcome all these barriers to find out the terms in which your wonderful doctor lives in a different world described to us today along the way. None of these things are easily overcome. We heard a good talk today on how mere tolerance doesn't do it. I don't think that any model which is reduced to wishy-washiness makes any contribution to civil discourse. You don't know who the other is. We have in Chicago a movement that many may have been on your campuses. A good friend of mine, Ibu Patel, an Indian-born Muslim who, the other day I was on with Paul Privino, president of Augsburg College, and I did a talk to 40 Augsburg students who were in Chicago. And Ibu started talking, and he sounds Lutheran and Catholic. That's what these students were. Yeah. Well, Ibu just gets into that world along the way. How does he do it? And I agree very much with him and his books. You never, ever promote this by suppressing the issues, defining them into non-existence, making it all seem nice and puffy and so on along the way. In the Interfaith Youth Corps, they work mainly on campuses, they will get 100 young people out, and in high schools in Chicago, they'll announce the topic. We're going to be at Nutria High School, and this time we're going to discuss what does your faith community have to say about how you read a text. Well, a Presbyterian goes home and yeah, okay, how do we read a text? Or what does your faith community have to say about the family? The kids are absolutely embarrassed. They never learned that was there until they confront the other. And I've never heard any bloodshed coming out of these, but understanding. I taught a course last year at the American Islamic College in Chicago. This is a side interest. I'm not an expert at it, but I'm not an expert on the virtues either, so I'm not scared of Muslims either. But I taught a course there with a Routledge reader on Christian-Muslim relations. I recommend it to you if you're ever in that. It's a wonderful book, Muslim-Christian relations. All theology. And that's what they want. There were 18 graduate students, all Muslim, and in professions already. And they're curious about facing up to these things, and yes, we'll do that. Well, you know very well, if you've ever done it, right off what comes up. The Trinity. I was glad your prayer had the Trinity. Let's start for the evening. The Trinity is a problem because the Father, Allah, cannot beget. You're stuck. And the Incarnation, which is the consequence thereof. Apart from that, they love Jesus. Boy, do they love Jesus. They know Jesus better than most Christians I know. He wasn't crucified, but he died and was risen and will come again. Look it up. Trinity they have more trouble with. Some years ago, I was invited to Houston for a Christian-Muslim dialogue by the Hakeem Olajuwon Foundation. You know Hakeem Olajuwon? I didn't. 7'2", Houston, whatever that team is called. And would I come and have a dialogue with a Nova Scotia Muslim? Well, no. It was on my desk in a big letterhead, Hakeem Olajuwon Foundation. My grandson, who played basketball in high school, was there. He saw on the top of the desk. What's happening? Well, I have an invitation to go speak for the Hakeem Olajuwon Foundation. It'd be 600 Christians, 600 Muslims. Houston has the huge petroleum crowd. So I knew they'd be Catholic and Baptist and know what they're talking about. And 600 Muslims. In the morning, we each spoke. and they got index cards to write out questions. And that was all ready for polygamy and what women wear and all those questions. Not one. Over lunch, they sorted them out, and we got to see them all. I lunched at a table with Hakim and two of his brothers. They were all above 7 feet, and I kept saying, when are they going to sit down? I was looking at them. I didn't even want to go, but my grandson saw this. He said, what is your honorarium? I said, I never said honorarium, whatever they do for some. Grandpa, I want you to go, and you set a price. The price is, I want an official basketball NBA with an autograph to Jonathan Marty from his friend Hakim. And he came. And all of them came, and I thought at first you could get away a little lightheartedly. The Trinity. Well, that's pretty rough stuff to start in. So I thought, well, at least show that we all have trouble with it. And I told the story of the missionary who was working with the Japanese potential convert. Yeah. Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Now I understand you Christians are ruled by a committee. And then he saw the symbol of the dove. Honorable Father, I understand. Honorable Son, I understand. Honorable Bird, I don't understand at all. That's all they want of that. From then on, now let's get serious. And pretty soon we were talking on a level of grad school, seminary, among these people. It's a select group. There are many to choose from in Houston, but there they were, and they wanted nothing but the discussion of early Christian on that and the Muslim side of it along the way. I don't know anybody that ever converted to the other side, but they all left understanding the other better, and I think they have a better civic discourse along the way. The hidden assumption behind all of this is with knowing the other and knowing the subject, caring about the subject deeply, is that the nature of the encounter, self with self, of I and thou, of the empathic orbit, of family, of congregation, denomination, of local community, or whatever, is, I think, the difference between argument and conversation. And I'm going to close with seeing what conversation can mean in the midst of that. Whatever I know about that, I got from my colleague next door, David Tracy, a Roman Catholic theologian of note. I jointly taught with him for a while. If you've ever read him, it's a rough slug. I was once invited to go with David Tracy to a conference on Bernard Lonergan, the Jesuit, who was really impenetrable, to discuss his book Insight, chapter 19. Nobody ever gets past it. This is 30 years ago when the honorarium was a trip to Bermuda for you and your spouse and $2,500 honorarium. And after a week, I said, I surrendered. I could mow lawns and get to Bermuda quicker than David Tracy wrote books about him, influenced by him along the way. And Lonergan, and I mean, Tracy, I got my theology from him, adjoining offices. So I got it by the vibrations of the wall, or capillary action, or osmosis, or however it passes. But I would get it from that, and we taught courses together. And I always said, first hour, David Tracy gives us the hard stuff. Second hour, Marty translates it into English. So I hope I was faithful to it along the way. But Tracy makes a distinction between argument and conversation. Argument is a very, very important tool. You can't have civic life without argument. You can't have legislation without argument. You can't have lab work without argument. Which is the right reading of this? What's the temperature? What's the mix? And so on. Argument is very important. But where is it located? Not in the first and the primary encounter, unless it's in a game, like a debate in high school where there are rules of the game. Why? Tracy observes in Lonergan's spirit, argument is dominated by your having the answer or an answer, and it's your job then to articulate it well, reason it well, and convince the other or defeat the other. Conversation is guided by the question, and you never know where it's going to go. I was chatting with somebody before, I was telling how I used to be invited during debates over school vouchers in public schools and I get to a community, and if I come in, I came here today to defend public school vouchers. In every suburb I knew, 51, if it was a Catholic edge, the 51 to 49, and the 51 went, oh, that's a great speech, oh man, it was great. Or if it was Baptist, and the other way around. Nobody ever changed their mind. And I just gave up on that. But I said, I'll accept your invitation, but can we play the game differently? With this group of citizens, serious people, honest people, learned people, middle class, college bred, you all care. You all went to public school. Some of you are teachers, some of you are parents. Can we in this group come up with 5 good suggestions for improving public education in America? I never left a gathering like that without hearing from the people gathered there a wave of ideas that wouldn't have come otherwise. So, I'm closing with this quotation by David Tracy from his book, Plurality and Ambiguity. Conversation is another kind of game from argument. It is a game where we learn to give in to the movement required by questions worth exploring. The movement in conversation is questioning itself. Neither my present opinions on the questions, nor the text's original response to it, the question, but the question itself must control every conversation. A conversation is a rare phenomenon, even for Socrates. It's not a confrontation. It's not a debate. It's not an exam. It is questioning itself. It is a willingness to follow the question or follow the question no matter where it may lead to. It is dialogue. Conversation is a game with some hard rules. Say only what you mean. Say it as accurately as you can. Listen to and respect what the other says, however other he or she may be. Be willing to correct or defend your opinions if challenged by the conversation partner, Oliver Cromwell. Be willing to argue if necessary. That comes up at the right time in conversations. To confront if demanded. To endure necessary conflict. To change your mind if evidence suggests it. These are merely some generic rules for questioning. As good rules, they are worth keeping in mind in case the questioning begins to break down. In a sense, these are merely variations of the transcendental imperative elegantly articulated by Bernard Lonergan. Be attentive, be intelligent, be responsible, be loving, and, if necessary, change. Thank you.